Welcome, everybody, to Pursuing Justice. We are now part of Apple Podcasts. I'm Harriet Hendel, and today we have two very special guests, Ken Hartman and his daughter, Aaliyah. But before we meet them, I wanted to mark a special milestone. It's just over 1 year since I created this podcast for Society Bites Radio. We invited and we've met 21 different guests, 3 exonerees, 4 staff members at the Innocence Project of Florida, a board member from the same organization, a director of a conviction integrity unit in Florida, 3 authors, an executive director of the first Innocence Project in the world located in New Jersey, a founder of a nonprofit to help those harmed by wrongful conviction, and its executive director as well, plus a group of young adults who have or had a parent in prison. On October the 2nd, we marked Wrongful Conviction Day across the U.S. And last October, I told my listeners that we Americans spend $2.6 billion on Halloween candy, to say nothing about decorations and costumes. So I wondered that even though Wrongful Conviction Day has passed, I wanted to ask each of my listeners to think about donating whatever you can to your local Innocence Project. That's the only tangible way that you can help. There is an Innocence Project in just about every state. You can Google it. Thanks so much. In doing this podcast, I'm attempting to highlight injustice in all of its many forms. Closest to my heart is wrongful conviction. But today, I would like to shine a light on another kind of injustice, life without parole. Our first guest is Ken Hartman, prison activist, writer for Harper's and New York Times, author of Mother California, Too Cruel, Not Unusual Enough, also featured in the HBO film Toe Tag Parole, a man who served 38 years in prison in California and was given his freedom by Governor Brown in 2017. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Harry. It's great to be here. Really looking forward to it.
Wonderful. All right, so let's begin by going backwards to 1980 when you were arrested and given a sentence of life without parole.
Well, it feels, in some ways, Harry, it almost feels like a different life. It's actually like more than 40 years ago now. And in some ways, it's one of those things, and I think for a lot of folks who end up in prison serving long periods of time, it's almost as if you have to really work to remember who you were at that time. I was 19 years old. I had lived a pretty dissolute life. I had come from a pretty dysfunctional family. I was trying to find the best way of saying it. I guess I was someone who was not really capable of functioning well in society, and that was manifested in my everyday life. And, drank every day, smoked pot every day, did harder drugs whenever I could get them. So it's as if I was a different person. I've been 31 years clean and sober now. And I'm now going to be 60 years old in a few months. So it really feels like another person, although it was clearly me, and I certainly don't want to, not accept responsibility for the things that I did, because it was me. And and on a February night in 1980, I was out late at night, drunk. I'd been up several days doing methamphetamines, and I ran into a man in Ramona Park in Long Beach, California. I later found out his name was Thomas Allen Fellows. He and I got in a stupid argument, and in a matter of probably seconds, it seems like it was like a flash. Um, he and I got in a fight, and Mr. Fellows was on the ground. I beat him to death. I did do that, and I accept full responsibility for that, and I will feel remorse for that for the rest of my life. So that's what happened, and that's how I ended up going to prison.
Wow. And how did you make the incredible adjustment to the life you had, and suddenly now you are inside a prison? What was that transition like for you at such a young age?
Yeah. Well, I think, in some ways, my young teenage life had pretty much prepared me for exactly where I ended up. I was in and out of juvenile halls, like the vast majority of people who end up in prison, the vast majority of whom, are in fact guilty, like me.
Right.
I lived a dissolute life. I was in and out of jail. I'd been arrested many times. I've been in juvenile hall many times. I'd been to counseling and all the other things that they do for troubled teenagers. And like the vast majority of young men who go to prison, I was between the age of 16 and 24. I was 19 years old. And I landed there, and I was surrounded by me, by the same kind of people. It was like, it wasn't, in a weird way, it wasn't that huge a transition, actually, which I know sounds probably a little crazy to hear, but that's kind of the truth of it,
Right. Yeah. Not. I understand what you're saying, that the kind of men that were inside were very much like you in terms of their behavior, their past, and their belief systems, right?
Very much.
In that kind of environment, what's the possibility to mature, to change, to grow up when what we do know about that age group, 18 to 24, 25, is that you are still very, very immature, that your brain function has not been complete and won't be until your mid-20s. So what kind of a chance is there for young men like that to make some changes?
Well, it's really, really tough. And I think, as anyone who knows about the prison system in this country knows, it has a dismal record of failure. And that's a big part of it. There's kind of a denial until fairly recently, Harriet, and I know you're up on the science of this because of what you've been involved in, but until fairly recently, these ideas that your brain wasn't finished developing until you're in your mid-20s was not considered a real thing. That's a fairly new reality that's been proven through science.
It is.
And I watched it every single day. I mean, I know that when I got into my mid-20s, in my case, because I was probably stupider than the average person, it was my late 20s, really. But, I made ridiculous decisions. I made decisions based on my emotions, not based on any kind of rationality. Because as we all now know, I had to use the emotion center of my brain to make decisions, which of course is a terrible idea.
Right.
And it results in terrible decisions. It's the reason the military likes young men, because young men don't think things through very well, So the prospects for young men at that age are actually pretty poor, and the system is not set up in a way to recognize that and say we are dealing with someone who really isn't capable of making rational choices. That's the problem, I think.
Right. Yeah, that's right. There isn't much in the way of rehabilitation coming from our criminal justice system. Now, you've written about many things, but one of the big topics that you have written about, and I'm sure spoken about, is something that you call, is this your terminology or someone else's, the other death penalty?
Well, I'm pretty sure I coined that term. I'm
Oh,
not
okay.
100% sure, but I never saw it anywhere else, and I wrote about it. And I mean, anyone's free to use it. I haven't trademarked it or anything, but but yeah. And what we're talking about there is this: is unlike virtually every other country on earth. I was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, which is I called the other death penalty because the expected outcome of a life without the possibility of parole sentence is death. And my feeling was, and this comes from the death penalty abolitionist community, many of which, not all, but many of which, for a very long time, seemed to advocated for the idea that the way to do away with death by lethal injection or whatever other methodology was being used was to trade that for life without the possibility of parole. And for those of us who had life without the possibility of parole, we were like, well, you're really just trading for a different methodology, a different way of killing people. It's not that you're doing away with the death penalty. You're trading lethal injection for a lethal term of imprisonment. And, so that's where it came about. I had been in prison for a fairly long time by that point. My brain had started to work fairly well, and I was able to sort of think through the reality that I was living in. And I realized that, hey, I've been sentenced to death. That's the reality of it. And I found out that there were more than 5,000 people in the state of California alone, more than 55,000 people in the United States. And just for I think one of the best comparisons I can give that I think highlights the disparity of this between other countries, particularly our peer nations. At one point in England, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that if you're a member of the EU, you could not sentence someone to, they had a different name for it, but it was the equivalent of what in the United States is called life without the possibility of parole. They said it was an unreasonable sentence, that all human beings should have some hope of getting out of prison. And they ordered England to re-sentence all the people in their prisons who had been sentenced to life without parole. In England, that amounted to 3 people.
Oh.
Now, if we kind of do the math here, England's about 60 million people, so we're probably about 6 times as big as England, thereabouts. So we would have equivalent, we'd have about 18, 20 people sentenced to life without parole. We've got 55,000 people sentenced to life without parole. So I think that's a good, way of looking at it from the perspective of how do we compare to our peer nations, but maybe even worse, there's hardly any country on earth that uses life without parole, even countries that we would think of as being particularly harsh and have particularly regressive prison systems, countries that we would refer to, in the unfair and, in sort of patriarchal terms of the West as undeveloped or underdeveloped countries. They don't use life without parole. I mean, it's really around the world. It's kind of an almost unheard of sentence. There's a very small number of people who usually have committed multiple murders or some other really high end type of crimes, and that's it. And that's not the truth for the United States, and certainly not for California.
Right. I did a little research today, actually, about this very topic. I was kind of curious to know where things stood with other countries. And maybe you don't know some of these statistics. I found them very interesting. Portugal abolished life without parole, and they were the very first country to do so, followed by, I should say, Mexico, Spain, Norway, Serbia, the Republic of Congo, and most Central and South American countries. However, in other countries, England, Wales, France, Germany, Denmark, and Norway, if someone's given a life sentence, there is a point at which they have to serve a certain amount of years, say around 15, maybe 18.